Well, it looks like the whole Iowa caucus debacle has been resolved for now. But of course, I don't think this is the last that we'll be hearing about the results of the Iowa caucus, even though now 100% of the votes are officially counted. Because, when you have the Iowa caucuses, there's the results, and then there's the results. Meaning that, once we have 100% of precincts reporting in, we don't necessarily know how things, how that will be recorded actually in terms of the actual final convention, how the delegates will be apportioned. This is sort of a forecast. What matters much more than the real results of the Iowa caucus, of who actually won, is who people think won. Because, Iowa is important because it sets the expectations for the campaign moving forward. It's the first big test to see of electoral viability of these various candidates. And so in terms of the narrative here, in terms of what actually matters coming out of Iowa, the perception that people are going to get, which, of course, is largely influenced by, media bias, is one of a draw between old Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders. Which, all in all, I don't think is a particularly unfair conclusion to draw from these results, because if you look at it, the amount of delegates that Sanders and Buttigieg won to the national convention are identical. I believe they both won 11. But in terms of the state delegates, the delegates to the state convention, Buttigieg did edge out Sanders by very little, by like 3, which is in terms of the Iowa caucuses, that is the margin of error as far as I'm concerned. Well within the margin of error, because there are always, especially the way that this was botched by the Democratic Party this time, to where it was just run so poorly. There's plenty of errors in terms of calculating all these results and things, because it is a rather complicated process, with multiple stages to it. It's not a very precise way of gauging things, at least very quickly, unless there's a decent enough of a spread between the candidates. But when things are close like this, you can't very well determine who a winner is. So I think it'd be fair to call this a draw between Buttigieg and Sanders at this point, even if perhaps later on they do some extra math and it turns out Bernie actually did win, or it turns out that maybe Buttigieg was in fact the actual winner as they're projecting him now. But of course, Buttigieg is the winner only in terms of one metric, the metric that counts for the delegates, but the metric that is the state delegates. But as far as Sanders is concerned, I think he should be happy that he won as far the actual popular caucus vote. Which, you're not going to be able to explain how all this stuff works to ordinary voters. But if you're talking in terms of electoral viability, that is a much better metric than, who actually won the most delegates based on the caucus process, because that has much more to do with the process, which is unique to the Iowa caucuses. It does not translate so well into, national elections. So if I were in Bernie's shoes, I would be trying to claim victory from this. Now, Buttigieg also, since, like I said, he is being called the winner by the media, can also claim victory. And in doing so, I think that Buttigieg is actually going to see a much bigger he has a lot more to gain from this whole Iowa caucus situation than Sanders did. I think that Buttigieg is much more poised to absorb, sort of the default Democrat vote, meaning the people who are not particularly deep thinkers when it comes to politics, people who don't have very strong opinions, but just happen to be Democrats, the sorts of people who would vote for, say, a Joe Biden. Joe Biden's big claim to fame is name recognition. It's that people know about him. It's that people know who he was. He's just like with Jeb Bush. That's why Jeb Bush was leading the polls for so long, and I think it's increasingly obvious based on how things have gone with Iowa and now with the polling in New Hampshire that Joe Biden is the Jeb Bush of this election cycle. And remember, a lot of people were thinking very early on that the same thing, that Joe Biden was the Jeb Bush of this cycle, but he kept going on. People kept predicting that he was going to implode and fall apart. But people forget that Jeb Bush stayed in the race until South Carolina. So he went through Iowa and lost. He went through New Hampshire and lost. And then when he lost again in South Carolina, he said, okay, that's good enough. I think we've done enough here. And Jeb was smart to get out then. But, people act like Joe Biden has stuck around, through thick and thin, and he's still maintained his lead. And it's like, well, no, that's not true. Because he hasn't he's been through one contest now, and he failed. So it looks like he's going to probably do the same thing that Jeb Bush did and start coming in fourth in every race until he drops out. And frankly, the sooner the better. If Pete is going to consolidate the default Democrat vote, the people who, like I said, are not the big political ideologues. The kinds of voters who care more about politics and have more passionate views are the people supporting either Warren or Sanders. And for that reason, I don't think that, either of them, certainly not Warren, since she's not going anywhere, but Sanders too, I don't think has as much to gain, because the kinds of people who support them tend to be very passionate and are going to be the types of people who stick by their person from the beginning through to the end. They're not like these people supporting Joe Biden who are just going with him because, that's old Uncle Joe, we know him. And so those kinds of people can much more quickly and easily flee that candidate. They don't have, in other words, as strong of a floor to their support. And that's why I think now, New Hampshire is going to be a very interesting test for Buttigieg to see if he can absorb all that, if he can, woo all those people away, which I don't think is going to be a very tough thing. If the media is able to successfully portray him as a winning candidate to ordinary people. Now, of course, it's crucial if Buttigieg is going to stop Sanders, and again, that's why I'm not, trying to frame this in a way to say that I'm trying to advocate on behalf of what is named Buttabutt. I actually think that he'd be a worst-case scenario nominee from my perspective. I don't want to see the Democrats put up that kind of person. So I'd much rather see someone who's not a bootlicker like Sanders, even though I don't like Sanders either for different reasons. As a spectator, I think it'd be much more interesting to watch two supposedly anti-establishment candidates, even though they don't necessarily go far enough for me, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders go head-to-head, than it would be to see, another boring, essentially, Hillary Clinton, as if she were a gay man, go up against Donald Trump. That would be boring as hell. But at this point, I think it's fair, since Warren and Biden have both faded, to look at this as a race between Sanders or Buttigieg. And of course, the betting markets have, pretty much crowned Sanders as the presumptive nominee at this point. Sanders' big obstacle is to try and build up a sense of inevitability before he gets to the states to where he's not polling so well, i.e. South Carolina, which is why New Hampshire is so important for him, and why Iowa, I think, was important for it. Frankly, I think Sanders didn't hurt himself in Iowa, but he really needed, in order to build himself up enough to where he could actually take the whole nomination, I think that he needed to win big in Iowa so that he could signal to people who, otherwise wouldn't really vote, support him under normal circumstances, that, hey, he's going to be the nominee, so you got to get behind him. And his finish in Iowa was not strong enough, given what the expectations were. It was not strong enough to create a bandwagoning effect. So Sanders needs to overperform in New Hampshire, I think, if he's going to have a decent shot in South Carolina. Because, again, I don't think that Sanders needs to come in first in South Carolina, but he needs to have a strong showing. And the tough thing, as I've said so many times, is that Sanders, and also Buttigieg, interestingly enough, but I'll get to that, really doesn't have much support amongst minorities. And when you get to the South, you get a lot of voters who are Democrats, not because they are, left-wingers that want, that hate Christianity and want, free whatever, free college debt being paid off for them. These aren't the kind of people who want, who want open borders and lots of illegal immigration to compete with them. What you have are, a lot of people who are either, older Democrats, more moderate Democrats, the old-timey default Democrats, and you also have just people who are Democrats because the Republicans are the white man's party. Which, again, I don't like to put things in stark racial terms like that. I don't like to paint, with a broad brush and make hasty generalizations. But the Democrats have worked very hard to make it to racialize their coalition and to make their politics about race, and that has it's reflected in reality. And it's just a fact that those people are not your democratic socialist types. They're not the people who were educated by these radical children of the 60s at the various state colleges. For the most part, obviously there are plenty of college-educated minorities in this country, but they're not the ones necessarily driving the zeitgeist in their communities, in the ordinary working class communities. And so someone like Sanders just so far has not been able to perform. I'm not saying that Bernie could never win the black vote. What I'm saying is that as of right now, he needs to, in order to win the black vote, to a certain extent, he doesn't have to win blacks in the South Carolina primary. Joe Biden could still win them but he needs to take a strong enough share to where he doesn't get blown out of the water. And he does that by essentially mainstreaming himself, not in terms of his ideas, but in terms of his, like I said, inevitability. If Sanders is a big candidate and it looks like he is, might win, people who, this is just the way that normal people's minds work, people who would not normally think to vote for Bernie will become open to him. I mean, that's what you're seeing with Buttigieg right now. Ever since he had a stronger than expected showing in Iowa, there's a new poll out in New Hampshire, a New Hampshire tracking poll that shows that since then he's gotten quite a boost off of that. And Buttigieg also is someone who has only ever really won with white voters. Of course, remember he is he's just a mayor of I believe the fourth largest city in Indiana. So he has never really participated in mass politics before. And his voters, like Sanders, are overwhelmingly white. It's just a different kind of white people. Sanders tends to have the the urban college-educated, starry-eyed left-wingers, and Buttigieg also gets your highly educated Democrats, but just not the left-wing ones. He gets the more typical neoliberal types, the ones who were genuinely excited about Hillary's campaign. The kinds of people who are horrified by Trump not because of what he does or his record as president. They're horrified by him because of how he talks. And, I don't mean to give the Bernie voters too much credit, but I think that for the most part, they have some actual concrete reasons for why they don't like Trump. It's not as simple as Orange Man bad. They're a little smarter, I think, than the average resistance crowd, participant, which I think those kinds of people are going to be much more open to someone like Buttigieg. Buttigieg's trying to play sort of that Obama role. Of being the blank slate, of not saying anything too complicated, anything that would commit him to any one position. He really hasn't said much of anything of substance. In fact, he tweeted out a graphic today with a quote that he thought was supposed to help him somehow and add to his campaign and get people to think, wow, this Pete guy, maybe he's someone I should support. And the quote was, "The shape of our democracy is the issue that affects all other issues." Now, what the hell does that mean? Thankfully, the tweet got ratioed. It has, last I checked, like 9,500 replies to about maybe 4,500 likes, which is way too many likes. But still, I'm glad it got ratioed. Because crap like that is exactly, what the corporate neoliberal establishment likes to say. Things like, democracy equals good. And see, we're voting. We're having an election. That means that you're in control of your own destiny, and that this government is, it does what you want, and that it all works for you, and that, we're not totally bought and paid for. That's kind of what Buttigieg's trying to signal there. And those are the kind of statements that I think, again, your ordinary Democrats are just going to lap right up. It's just like when a Republican says something dumb like, I don't know, either you stand for the flag or you stand with the terrorists or something, equally brain dead. But the average voter, will eat that kind of crap up. They think that that's a great quote. And the average voter might actually like what Buttigieg said, even though people on Twitter ratioed it. Because Twitter, of course, is not the electorate. Twitter is not reflective of what ordinary people are thinking. There's a very, very small group of us who use Twitter every day and live on there. Normies use sites like Reddit and Facebook, which I think are completely unbearable personally. I'm much happier sticking to Twitter and 4chan. But that, of course, is besides the point. I think the real point here that I lose sight of sometimes is that we really are witnessing, and I think a lot of people on the left tend to see this a lot better since they are looking from the inside, that we are watching the real battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. And I think that's a cliche that gets overused, but it's accurate in this case. And I think it's a much more fierce battle than we saw for the Republican Party in 2016, because for all of the never-Trumper whining about how Trump was going to, turn the Republicans into some European-style right-wing party that, didn't believe in war and believed in lots of welfare and high tariffs and things. And in reality, Trump hasn't accomplished really anything that he set out to do, and he seems content with that. He's happy just sort of spewing his platitudes and not really getting much done of the different things. He did what Republicans always do, and that's cut tariffs. It's not like he's been the enemy of businesses. Sure, the tariffs thing haven't been great. I don't think tariffs are a good idea for different reasons, not because I'm a corporate shill. But fundamentally, the special interests who were associated with the Republican Party before Trump are still associated with the Republican Party. He didn't shake things up too badly. He didn't drive a wedge in the party. Quite the opposite. I think that the Republican Party is much more energized and unified than they were when Mitt Romney was their candidate. And the reason for this is that, Trump is a largely malleable figure. And so to the extent that he was going to, that he could alienate the other Republicans with his views, he moderated on that. And he was able to bring them all pretty much into the fold by trying to make everyone happy. Someone like, Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg are not really going to do that. I think they both represent very different sides of the Democratic Party. You have your more, grassroots left-wingers represented by Bernie, and then you have the natural special interests and the corporate donors represented by Buttigieg. And of course, like I said before, the suburban, nondescript neoliberal types. I think I know a lot of Democrats who would happily vote for someone like Pete Buttigieg. I actually don't know as many who would like Bernie. But that's because I'm in Florida, where there are lots of old people. Old people who may, in fact, if push comes to shove, not show up for Bernie Sanders. And on the other side, you have a significant number of people, far more, I think, than on the Buttigieg side, or I should say on the more typical centrist establishment side, who, if Buttigieg's the guy, they're not going to show up for him. And so the rift, I don't think, can be healed in the Democratic Party. This primary is going to continue to exacerbate it, whereas the Republican primary in 2016 healed it largely. Trump united the Tea Party and the establishment, more so than they were before 2016. And already by 2016, the so-called Tea Party folks from 2010 were almost completely co-opted, but you still had those holdouts of the Freedom Caucus that could act as a block to try and block certain legislation and hold leverage over the Republican majority back in the days of John Boehner. But Trump was able to completely unify that caucus. Someone like Bernie or Buttigieg or whatever, though, like I said, it's not going to happen. So I'm going to continue to sit back and watch all of it burn. I think it'll be quite glorious. I think it'd be great if, in fact, the Democrats split into two different parties. Not necessarily because I want to see one-party Republican rule across America. I think that would also be bad. But because I would love, after so long, to see one of the two major political parties crash and burn. Of course, I'd prefer it happen to both of them, but I'll take what I can get. And so the New Hampshire primary is the next step down that road, the road to destruction. And so I hope, for the sake of entertainment, that Bernie does quite well, and that Buttigieg has a strong second showing, but still, maybe 3 points behind Sanders. And most importantly, at this point, I think that Joe Biden needs to fall flat on his face so that perhaps, although I think he's going to wait till South Carolina anyway, perhaps he'll drop out, and you'll have that full. Once importantly, Biden drops out, once Bernie has built up significant momentum. So by that point, even if Buttigieg is able to completely unite the default Democrat vote behind him, he will be unable to stop Sanders, and it will be a glorious watching the mainstream media absolutely freak out and see the the DNC soil themselves. So this has already gone about twice the length of a video as it probably should have been. So I think I'll sign off here. And if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.